You're done here, Elena. Pack your things. You have 10 minutes before security escorts you to the curb. And don't even bother looking at the bonus accrual on your screen. That $10 million commission for the Hanguk merger stays with the firm. It's corporate property now, just like you were. The words didn't drift. They slammed into the soundproof glass of the 50th floor boardroom, like a bird hitting a windshield. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I simply watched the sunlight catch the gold nib of the fountain pen sitting on the mahogany table, the same pen my father had given me when I closed my first $100 million deal. Standing across from me was Julian, my brother-in-law, and our newly minted chief operating officer. At 40, Julian was the embodiment of Silicon Valley slick, expensive veneers, a $5,000 tech weave suit, and a soul that had been replaced by a spreadsheet long ago. He adjusted his cufflink with a smirk that felt like a physical, oily stain on the room. Beside him stood Clara, my older sister. She was draped in Chanel, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Looking at me not as a sibling, but as a bug she had finally managed to trap under a heel. Clara had been named CEO by our parents exactly 3 weeks ago, despite the fact that her only real experience with growth was her Instagram follow account and a failed boutique candle line. The Hanguk biotech merger is entering the finalization phase, Clara announced. Her voice practiced and cold, mimicking the tone of a shark she'd seen in a documentary. We've decided that having a strategic cultural liaison is a luxury the Vance Group no longer requires. We're streamlining Elena, moving toward a more agile future. A luxury? I finally spoke my voice, a low, steady hum. I've spent the last 7 years living in hotels in Seoul. I've sat through 3,000 hours of negotiations. I am the only person in this building who has the personal cell phone number of Chairman Han. I built the bridge that this $3 billion deal is walking across. Julian let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He leaned forward, resting his palms on the table. Eleanor, let's be real. You're a glorified tour guide with an Ivy League degree, Julian sneered. You think your deep understanding of Korean honor makes you special. We just integrated the Apex 7 AI Enterprise Suite. It cost us $199 a month. It can translate legal Hanja, analyze South Korean biotech regulations, and draft closing memos in 6 seconds. Why would I pay you a $10 million commission when a piece of software can do your job for the price of a nice steak dinner? He tapped his temple, looking incredibly proud of his own disruptive genius. Business is about leverage and numbers, not tea ceremonies and bowing, he continued. Once we land in Seoul and show them the Vance Group's balance sheet, Chairman Han will sign. He wants the money, Eleanor. He doesn't care about the girl who translated his daughter's graduation speech. I looked at them. Really looked at them. I saw the greed in Clara's eyes, the desperate need to prove she was the alpha daughter. I saw the hollow arrogance in Julian, a man who mistook efficiency for wisdom. A wave of absolute freezing clarity washed over me. They were so certain. They were so incredibly dangerously wrong. They thought a $199 algorithm could navigate the minefield of a 500-year-old cultural legacy. They thought Chairman Han, a man who valued Inhua, the harmony of people above all else, would respond well to Julian's aggressive American disruption. But most importantly, they hadn't read the fine print. Because I had drafted the original Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, by hand. Chairman Han had insisted on a very specific, non-negotiable clause. He called it the Personal Trust Integrity Provision. In the legal world of high-stakes international mergers, it's known as a Key Personnel Clause. The clause stated in ironclad legal terminology that the entire $3 billion merger was strictly contingent upon my continuous direct oversight. Without my signature on the final closing certificate, the deal wasn't just paused, it was legally dead. And the kicker. The termination for convenience of that key personnel would trigger a $500 million good faith penalty payable to Hanguk Systems immediately. Julian and Clara hadn't seen it. They had run the English summary through their $199 AI, and the AI had flagged the clause as a standard administrative notification. It didn't understand the weight of the Korean characters attached to it. I didn't tell them. 10 minutes, Elena, Clara reminded me, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. Security is already at your desk. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles in my skirt. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for my bonus. I didn't tell them they were about to walk into a buzzsaw. I hope the AI knows how to handle a 45-degree bow, Julian. I said, my voice smooth as silk. And Clara, be careful with the tea. If you pour it with one hand, you might as well be spitting on their ancestors. I turned on my heel and walked out. The walk to my desk was a blur of glass and steel. My colleagues, people I had mentored, people I had saved from Julian's restructuring rants, all suddenly found their keyboards fascinating. Nobody looked up. The Vance poison had already spread. 2 burly security guards in dark suits stood by my cubicle. They didn't say a word. They just watched as I reached into my drawer. I didn't grab the stapler or the spare chargers. I grabbed one thing. A small, intricate silk knot, a norigai that Chairman Han's wife had given me. To them, it was a piece of string. To the deal, it was the soul of the contract. I unclipped my company ID. The plastic felt cheap in my hand. I set it on the desk next to my corporate credit card, the one they had undoubtedly already deactivated. Good luck, boys, I whispered to the guards. As I walked toward the brass elevators, I felt the eyes of the entire office on my back. They thought they were watching a funeral. They thought they were seeing the end of the disappointment of the Vance family. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to slide shut, I caught a glimpse of Julian and Clara through the glass walls of the boardroom. They were clinking glasses of sparkling water, laughing already, spending the $10 million they thought they had saved. The doors closed with a soft, expensive chime. I stood alone in the descending metal box, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. They thought they had fired me. They thought they had stripped me of my legacy and my home. They had no idea. They hadn't just fired an employee. They had removed the only person holding the roof up. And in about 72 hours, when they touched down in Seoul, the entire Vance empire was going to come crashing down on their heads. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard plastic of my personal burner phone. I hadn't even reached the lobby before I began drafting a very private, very respectful message to Chairman Han. The war hadn't ended. It had just moved to a different theater. And I was the only one who knew the terrain. I stepped out into the humid San Francisco afternoon, the salty air of the bay filling my lungs. I looked back up at the Vance Tower, a gleaming monument to my family's greed. "Enjoy the view while it lasts," I whispered. I walked away, my heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the pavement. I was jobless, I was homeless, and I was officially the most dangerous woman in the Pacific Rim. The fog was rolling in thick from the bay, a cold grey blanket that felt like a physical manifestation of my life being erased. I sat on a park bench 3 blocks away from the Vance Tower, staring at the screen of my personal phone. My corporate accounts were already dead red. My email was gone. My Slack was deactivated. And when I tried to log into the company's cloud to retrieve my personal photos, the screen flashed a mocking "access denied." "Contact your administrator." I took a shaky breath and dialed my father's private line. Arthur Vance didn't answer on the first ring, or the second. He made me wait until the very last second, a classic power move he'd taught me himself. "Eleanor," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. No hello, no "are you okay?" Just my name spoken like a line item he was considering deleting. "Dad, I assume you heard," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Julian and Clara just escorted me out. They're claiming I'm being replaced by an enterprise AI. They're withholding my commission. There was a long silence. I could hear the clink of a crystal glass on his end, his mid-afternoon scotch. I didn't just hear it, Eleanor. I signed off on it. The air left my lungs. You signed off on it, Dad. I've given this firm 7 years. I brought the Hanguk deal to the finish line. You know Julian doesn't understand the Seoul market. He's going to blow it. Julian has presented a very compelling case for the future of the Vance Group, Arthur said, his tone shifting into the chairman persona. Technology is the new frontier. Your mother and I feel that you've become too emotionally invested in these Eastern partnerships. You've lost the killer instinct. Clara, on the other hand, understands the brand. She understands the optics. Optics don't sign billion-dollar contracts, Dad. Trust does, I snapped. Enough, he barked, and the sound made me flinch. You've always been the difficult one, Eleanor. Always questioning, always wanting to do things the traditional way. Well, the world has changed. Consider this a sabbatical, a very permanent one. So that's it. You're just going to let them rob me. You aren't being robbed. You're being compensated for your time with a lessons learned experience, he said coldly. And don't bother coming by the Sausalito house tonight. Your mother is already having the locks changed. She's finally getting that wellness studio she wanted. Since you won't be using the guest suite anymore, we've decided to repurpose the space for Clara's daughter. It has the best natural light for her virtual violin lessons. The cruelty was so casual it was breathtaking. My childhood home, my sanctuary, gone in the space of a phone call. Where am I supposed to go, Dad? My salary was tied to the firm's housing allowance. My car is a company lease. You're a smart girl, Elena. Figure it out. But if you try to contact the Hanguk team or interfere with Julian's trip, I will have the legal department bury you in non-disclosure litigation until you're 60. Do I make myself clear? The line went dead. I sat there, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I wasn't just fired. I was being purged. My sister got the CEO chair, my brother-in-law got my commission, and my niece got my bedroom. I was a ghost in my own life. I checked my banking app. My heart dropped. The Vance Group had clawback clauses in their contracts for unsatisfactory termination. Not only was my bonus gone, but they had frozen my primary checking account, claiming it was an auxiliary corporate account, because my direct deposits and expenses were managed through the firm's private bank. I had exactly $412 in a secondary account I'd opened years ago and forgotten about. I looked at the Norigai silk knot in my hand. It was the only thing I owned that they couldn't touch. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I had to move. If I stayed on this bench, I'd drown in the fog. By 8 p.m., the Vance grace had officially expired. I had watched from across the street as a locksmith arrived at my Sausalito apartment, the one the company provided, and changed the cylinders. 2 movers began hauling my designer furniture into a van marked Vance Logistics. They weren't even letting me keep my bed. I stood in the shadows of the streetlights, clutching a single duffel bag filled with whatever I could cram in during my 10-minute escort and a few things I'd kept in my car. My car, which I'd had to abandon at a parking garage because the GPS tracker would lead them straight to me if I tried to steal it. I caught an Uber to a pawn shop in a gritty corner of Oakland. It was a place where the neon signs flickered with a desperate, buzzy energy. The man behind the counter had skin like cracked leather and eyes that had seen every tragedy in the Bay Area. I placed my watch on the velvet pad, a limited edition Patek Philippe, a gift from Chairman Han for the first phase of the merger. It's worth $80,000, I said, my voice sounding hollow. He didn't even look at the movement. He just squinted at me. To you, maybe. To me, it's a liability. I can give you $15,000. Cash. No paper trail. That's an insult. The insult is the world we live in, sweetheart, he muttered. Take it or leave it. You look like you need to disappear, and disappearance costs money. I took the cash. It felt heavy and dirty in my hand, a stack of hundreds that represented the death of my dignity. I spent the next 3 hours searching for a place to sleep. Every nice hotel required a credit card for an incidental deposit, a card I no longer had. I eventually found a residential motel near the shipping docks. The air smelled of diesel and salt, and the walls were so thin I could hear the muffled cough of the man in the next room. I sat on the edge of the stained nylon bedspread, my duffel bag tucked under my feet. The room was illuminated by the rhythmic flashing of a street lamp outside. Flash. Dark. Flash. Dark. I pulled out my burner phone. I hadn't sent the message to Chairman Hahn yet. I needed to be careful. If I moved too fast, Julian would see it as interference, and Arthur would unleash the lawyers. I needed to wait for Julian to fail on his own. I opened a hidden encrypted folder on my phone, the one place the Vance group couldn't reach. It contained my black box, 7 years of handwritten notes, private observations, and the untranslated drafts of every meeting with Hanguk Systems. I scrolled down to the Juyo Ginji, the key personnel clause. Julian's AI would have translated it as a standard managerial continuity provision. It would have told him that the manager must remain in place. Julian, in his infinite ego, assumed he was the manager now. But the Korean text used a very specific term, jiwi. It didn't just mean a job title, it referred to a specific spiritual and professional lineage. The contract wasn't tied to the COO of Vance Group. It was tied to Elena Vance, daughter of Richard Ward, of the Han Vance Accord. By firing me, they hadn't just changed a name on a door. They had legally severed the cord of trust. Under South Korean law, and specifically under the arbitration clause we'd signed in Singapore the moment I was terminated, without cause or consultation with the partner, the Vance Group became liable for a $500 million penalty. Not to me, but to Hanguk Systems. It was a kill switch. I had put it there as a safety net, never dreaming my own family would be the ones to trip the wire. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a news alert from the Wall Street Journal app. Vance Group announces global expansion. COO Julian Thorne to finalize $3 billion biotech merger in Seoul. This Friday, there was a photo of Julian and Clara. They were standing in front of a private jet, smiling like they'd just conquered the world. The caption mentioned streamlined operations and AI-driven efficiency. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my chest. "You idiots," I whispered to the empty peeling room. "You're not flying to a signing, you're flying to an execution." I thought about my room in Sausalito now being prepped for a violin-playing child who would never know the cost of the floor she walked on. I thought about my father's scotch and my mother's wellness. They had taken everything. My home, my money, my name, my pride. They had left me in a cockroach-infested motel in Oakland with nothing but $15,000 in blood money and a silk knot. They wanted me to be a victim. They wanted me to crawl back in 6 months, begging for a junior analyst position and a second chance. I stood up and walked to the cracked mirror above the sink. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at my reflection. My eyes were red-rimmed, but the fire in them was terrifying. I wasn't going to crawl. I pulled the norigai out of my pocket and tied it to the strap of my duffel bag. It was a signal, a promise. I sat back down at the small, rickety desk and began to type. Not a message of desperation, but a masterpiece of strategy. I reached out to a contact I'd made years ago, a man named Silas, a shark of a lawyer who specialized in corporate divorce and who hated my father with a passion that rivaled my own. Message Silas. The Vance Group just tripped the kill switch. I have the keys to the vault. but I'm currently a ghost in Oakland. I need a war chest and a seat at the table when the smoke clears. Are you in? The reply came back 3 minutes later. Silas. I've been waiting 10 years for Arthur to trip over his own ego. I'll have a car at your location in 20 minutes. Don't worry about the bill. Eleanor. The look on your father's face when we seize the tower will be payment enough. I grabbed my bag. The motel room suddenly felt too small for the ambition blooming in my gut. Julian and Clara were currently 30,000 feet in the air, sipping champagne and dreaming of their billion-dollar future. They thought they had won because they had the titles and the building. They forgot that a building is just stone and glass. A deal is made of people. And they had just declared war on the only person the other side actually liked. As I walked out of the motel and saw the black sedan pulling up to the curb, I felt the shift in the air. The fog was lifting. The path was clear. The Vance group was about to learn a very expensive lesson. You can replace a person with an algorithm, but you can't replace a soul with a spreadsheet. And you should never ever kick a Vance when she's down, because we don't just get up. We take over. The black sedan Silas sent was a silent sanctuary of leather and tinted glass. As we crossed the Bay Bridge, the skyline of San Francisco glittered like a taunt. I watched the Vance Tower's logo, a stylized V that I had helped modernize, glow white against the night sky. Silas didn't ask questions. He knew the game. He dropped me at a black site condo in Pacific Heights, a place owned by a shell company that even my father's private investigators couldn't track. I didn't sleep. I spent the night in a high-back chair, my laptop glowing in the dark, dissecting the monster I had created. The Apex 7 AI suite Julian was so proud of was a marvel of linear logic, but it was culturally illiterate. I ran the Korean text of the Juyoginji clause through a similar enterprise AI to see what Julian was seeing. The result was laughable. The AI translated the term jiwi as current operational position. It interpreted the clause as, the merger requires the presence of the chief operating officer. Julian, having stolen my title in all but name, before officially firing me, believed he was the current operational position. But in the original Hanja characters, I had insisted on including in the footnotes. Characters Julian wouldn't even recognize the meaning was far more granular. It specified the firstborn lineage of the founder's second house. In the world of Chairman Han, business wasn't a contract, it was an adoption. By firing me, the Vance Group hadn't just changed a manager. They had committed an act of family betrayal, which, according to the contract's moral turpitude subclause, triggered the immediate rescission of all intellectual property licenses. If they signed that final document in Seoul without me, the Vance Group wouldn't just lose the deal. They would lose the rights to the very biotech patents that kept their domestic firms solvent. It's a scorched earth protocol, Silas said, leaning against the doorframe at 3 a.m., holding 2 cups of black coffee. It wasn't meant to be, I whispered, taking a cup. It was meant to protect us from a hostile takeover. I never thought the hostiles would be inside the house. Your father always was a better predator than a parent, Silas remarked, sitting across from me. He thinks he's playing chess. Julian thinks he's playing a video game. But you, Eleanor, you're playing Go. You've surrounded them, and they don't even see the stones on the board yet. I looked at the clock. Julian and Clara were likely over the Pacific right now. They would land at Incheon in 12 hours. They would have a day to acclimatize before the Friday morning signing. I need to be in Seoul, I said. Not as a Vance, as a ghost. Already handled, Silas said, sliding a folder across the table. New passport, new name, and a seat on a private charter leaving from San Jose in 4 hours. You're going as a consultant for Apex Alpha. I froze. Apex Alpha was my father's greatest rival. They had been trying to break into the Korean biotech market for a decade. If I go with Apex, I'm committing treason in my father's eyes, I said. Silas smiled, and it was a predatory, beautiful thing. Eleanor, they already executed you. You're just returning the favor. Before I could leave for the airport, the second wave of the purge hit. I tried to call my old assistant Marcus, just to tell him where to find my personal files. The call went straight to a generic, "This number is no longer in service" recording. 10 minutes later, I received a notification on my burner phone from a private industry forum. Alert. Elena Vance flagged for serious professional misconduct and theft of proprietary data. Employment caution advised for all member firms. Julian hadn't just fired me. He was salt-earthing my entire career. He had sent a red notice to every major venture capital firm in the valley. My name was now radioactive. He's efficient, I'll give him that, I muttered, staring at the screen. I decided to test the waters. I reached out to 3 friends I had helped get jobs at Google and Meta. I sent simple messages. "Hey, I'm in a spot. Can we talk?" The read receipts appeared instantly. Then one by one, the "user has blocked you" notifications followed. The Vance name was a shield when you were inside the fortress, but when you were cast out, it became a target. Julian and Clara weren't just taking my job. They were erasing my existence from the industry. They wanted to make sure that even if I survived the night, I would never work in this town again. I stood in the middle of the dark condo, feeling the weight of the silence. In San Francisco, if you don't have a network, you don't exist. I was a 31-year-old woman with a decade of high-level experience, and as of 5 a.m., I was less than a shadow. "They think they've boxed you in," Silas said as we headed to the car. "They think that by cutting off your oxygen, you'll suffocate." "They forgot one thing," I said, looking out at the San Jose hills as the sun began to peek over the horizon. "I've been breathing the air in Seoul for 7 years. I don't need the valley's oxygen anymore." At the private terminal, the Apex Alpha jet sat waiting a sleek, midnight blue Gulfstream. Standing at the stairs was a man I recognized from a dozen most feared CEO lists, Victor Sterling. Victor was the man my father called the barbarian at the gate. He was younger than my father, sharper, and had built his empire on the ruins of legacy firms that refused to adapt. "Elena Vance," Victor said, his voice a rich baritone. He didn't offer a hand, he offered a glass of chilled juice. "I heard you were looking for a ride to Seoul, and perhaps a new family." "I'm not looking for a family, Mr. Sterling," I said, stepping onto the stairs. "I'm looking for a tactical alliance." "Psychic." "Even better," he chuckled. "Your father thinks he's sending a prince and princess to claim a kingdom. He has no idea he sent them into a trap you set years ago." "I didn't set it for them," I corrected him. "I set it for anyone foolish enough to think they could buy Chairman Han's loyalty with a spreadsheet." As the jet climbed over the Pacific, I pulled out my laptop. I wasn't looking at Vance Group data anymore. I was looking at the Apex Alpha portfolio. "If we're going to do this," I told Victor, "we don't just take the Hanguk deal. We take the entire Vance supply chain. When Julian fails, and he will fail spectacularly, the Hanguk patents will go into a locked trust. I am the only person who can unlock them, and I'm going to hand the key to you." "In exchange for what?" Victor asked, leaning back in his leather seat. "In exchange for the Vance Tower." I said, my voice cold and clear. "I want the building, I want the name, and I want to be the one who signs the eviction notice for my sister." Victor watched me for a long moment, then nodded. "You're a cold one, Elena. I like that. Let's go to Seoul." The flight was 14 hours of pure adrenaline-fueled strategy. While Julian and Clara were likely celebrating in first class on a commercial flight, thinking they were the masters of the universe, I was rebuilding the map of the global biotech industry. I looked out the window at the endless blue. Below us, somewhere in the vastness, was the flight carrying my family. They were moving toward a victory that was actually a cliff. I thought about the motel in Oakland. I thought about the pawn shop. I thought about the locks being changed on my Sausalito home. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was being paved over by a layer of ice. I realized that my father was right about one thing. I had lost my killer instinct. I had been too loyal, too focused on the family brand. But as the coast of Incheon began to appear through the clouds, I felt that instinct returning. It was sharper than before. It was no longer the instinct of a daughter trying to please her father. It was the instinct of an architect who was about to watch her first creation burn so she could build something much, much bigger on the ashes. "We're landing," Victor announced. "Oh, are you ready to be a ghost?" I pulled a pair of dark sunglasses from my bag and adjusted my coat. "No," I said. "I'm ready to be a nightmare." The wheels hit the tarmac with a definitive thud. I was back in Seoul, my city, my turf, and the Vance family had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was already beginning to crack. I stepped off the plane into the crisp Korean air. The humidity was different here. It felt like a homecoming. I took a deep breath, the scent of the sea and the city filling my lungs. Julian and Clara would be arriving at their hotel soon. They would be greeted with bows and polite smiles. They would think they were being honored. They wouldn't realize that in Korea, the most polite smile is often the one given to someone you've already decided to destroy. "Welcome back, Elena," I whispered to myself. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was on the streets of Seoul, and I had the home court advantage. Julian and Clara landed at Incheon International Airport with the subtlety of a brass band in a cathedral. They were greeted by a junior protocol officer from Hanguk Systems, a young man named Min Ho, who I had personally mentored for 3 years. I watched from a distance, leaning against a marble pillar in the arrivals hall, dressed in an oversized trench coat and a silk scarf that masked my profile. Julian didn't bow. He offered a firm, aggressive American handshake and immediately began talking about the tight schedule. "We need to get to the Schiller," Julian barked, his voice echoing in the refined space of the terminal. "And make sure the suite has a hardwired connection. I need to run a final diagnostic on the Apex 7 AI before the morning briefing." Efficiency is the name of the game, Min Ho. So, Min Ho's smile didn't flicker, but I saw the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes. In Korea, that was the equivalent of a middle finger. Min Ho looked around his eyes, scanning the crowd, almost as if he were searching for me, for the person who actually knew how to speak to him. He found nothing but the cold gaze of the Vance siblings. By the time they reached the Schiller Hotel, the disaster was already in motion. Julian had insisted on using his $199 AI software to generate a culturally optimized greeting for the preliminary dinner with Hanguk's board of directors. I was staying at a discreet boutique hotel in Bukchon, 3 miles away, huddled over a secure monitor with Victor Sterling. We had access to the Schiller's banquet hall audio Silas had donated to the hotel's security fund years ago. "Listen to this," Victor whispered, handing me a headset. The dinner started. I heard the clink of fine porcelain and the low melodic murmur of the Korean executives. Then came Julian. "Chairman Han," Julian's voice boomed through the speakers. He was using the AI's real-time voice cloning translation feature. "It is a profitable honor to meet you. We are here to liquidate the old ways and disrupt the market together." The AI had translated profitable honor, using a term usually reserved for the sale of livestock, and liquidate. It used a word that in a biotech context sounded disturbingly like mass euthanasia. A deathly silence followed. I could almost feel the temperature in that room drop 40 degrees. "Julian, stop," I whispered to the empty air, but he didn't stop. He pushed further. He began to talk about the redundancy of human oversight. He told the board, through the tinny, digitized voice of the AI, that the Vance Group's new strategy was to move away from relationship-based friction and toward algorithmic certainty. Beside him, Clara was worse. She was wearing a sleeveless, bright red cocktail dress, a color associated with joy in some cultures, but at a formal high-stakes business dinner in Seoul, it looked like a bloodstain. She reached for the teapot before Chairman Han had even touched his glass. She poured her own tea. With one hand. I closed my eyes. One hand. In Korea, pouring your own drink with one hand at a formal dinner is a gesture of profound disrespect, implying that the host is beneath your notice. "They're doing it," Victor said, a grin spreading across his face. "They're actually doing it. They're burning the bridge while they're still standing on it." "It's not just a bridge, Victor," I said, my heart pounding. "That's a 7-year-old temple they're desecrating." The dinner ended an hour early. Chairman Han stood up, bowed exactly 15 degrees, the bare minimum required for politeness, and left without a word. Julian, oblivious to the frostbite in the room, turned to Clara and high-fived her. "See?" Julian's voice caught on the mic. The AI said the sentiment analysis was 98% positive. They were so impressed, they didn't even know what to say. "We've got them, Clara. Tomorrow morning we own the future." I took off the headset. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a terrifying mix of grief and anticipation. The Vance Group, the company my grandfather built, the company I had bled for, was now being led by two people who couldn't read a room if the walls were screaming at them. "Get some sleep, Elena," Victor said. "Tomorrow is the signing, or rather the funeral." Friday morning in Seoul was grey and drizzling. The kind of weather that makes the granite skyscrapers of Gangnam look like tombstones. The signing ceremony was set for 10 a.m. at the Hanguk Systems headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass that symbolized South Korea's biotech dominance. Julian and Clara arrived in a fleet of black limousines. Followed by a swarm of American journalists, they had flown in to document their triumph. I was already inside. Victor Sterling had secured me a seat in the back of the observation gallery under my new alias. I wore a sharp charcoal grey suit, my hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. I looked like just another high-level consultant. The boardroom was a masterpiece of cold elegance. On one side sat the Vance contingent, Julian, Clara, and 4 lawyers who looked like they hadn't slept since they left San Francisco. On the other side sat Chairman Han and his council, 10 men in dark suits, their faces as unreadable as stone. Julian opened his laptop and projected the final contract onto the wall. "Chairman Han, too." Julian began his tone patronizingly slow. "We've reviewed the final drafts through our Apex 7 system. The efficiencies are optimized. The Vance Group is ready to lead Hanguk into the AI era. We just need the final digital signatures." Chairman Han didn't look at the screen. He looked at the empty chair next to Julian, the chair where I was supposed to be sitting. "Where is Ms. Vance?" the chairman asked. His voice was quiet, but it cut through Julian's bravado like a razor. "Eleanor." Julian waved a hand dismissively. "She's no longer with the firm. Administrative restructuring. We've found that her specific skill set was no longer necessary given our new technological capabilities." Clara chimed in, her voice pitched for the microphones. "Eleanor has decided to take a personal leave for her health. We wish her the best. But the Vance Group is more than just one person." I saw Min Ho standing behind the chairman tighten his grip on a folder. Chairman Han leaned back. He signaled to his lead counsel, a man named Mr. Park, who had been my primary legal sparring partner for half a decade. Mr. Thorne. Mr. Park said, his English perfect and lethal. We have spent the last 12 hours performing a human audit of the contract you submitted yesterday. It appears your software failed to flag several critical cultural and legal addendums. Julian's smirk faltered. The AI is infallible, Mr. Park. It's been trained on 3 million legal precedents. Perhaps, Mr. Park replied. But it has not been trained on the Juyo Gingi clause, specifically the footnote on page 114 written in traditional Hanja. Julian blinked. Hanja. That's just decorative. It's a legacy formality. The English translation is what matters. In this building, Chairman Han said, speaking for the first time in English, the heart matters more than the ink, and the Hanja is the heart. Mr. Park stood up and tapped a button. The projector changed. A single clause was highlighted in red. This clause, Mr. Park explained to the room and to the cameras, states that the entire intellectual property transfer and the $3 billion merger are contingent upon the uninterrupted personal stewardship of Elena Vance. It further states that any termination of Ms. Vance without the expressed written consent of Hanguk Systems constitutes a bad faith breach. The colour drained from Julian's face so fast I thought he might faint. That's a clerical error. That shouldn't be in there. We can just strike it. You cannot strike the foundation of a house once the roof is on Mr. Thorne, Chairman Han said. By firing Elena Vance, by treating a partner of this house like a disposable tool, you have told me exactly how you will treat my company. You have used a $50 machine to replace a 7-year bond of blood. It was $199, Julian shouted, his composure snapping. It was a pathetic, small-minded correction. Clara grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with terror. Chairman, please. We can bring her back. We'll call her. We'll give her whatever she wants. You cannot call back the dead, Chairman Han said. He stood up. The entire Hanguk board stood with him in perfect unison. According to the breach penalty we agreed upon, Mr. Park continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. The Vance Group is now liable for a $500 million good faith penalty payable within 48 hours. Furthermore, all licensing agreements for Hanguk's biotech patents are hereby revoked. You are no longer our partners. You are our debtors. You can't do this, Clara shrieked. We have a signed MOU. The MOU died the moment you escorted Elena Vance from her office, Chairman Han said. He turned his back on them. Julian looked like he was about to vomit. He looked at the American journalists who were now frantically typing on their phones. The headline was already written, Vance Group collapses in Seoul. $3 billion deal, dead on arrival. Wait, Julian yelled, stumbling toward the chairman. We can fix this. We'll pay the penalty. We'll find Eleanor. You don't have to find me, Julian, I said, standing up in the back of the gallery. The room froze. 100 heads turned toward me. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking against the polished floor. The journalists' cameras swiveled, the flashes blinding. Julian stared at me as if I were a ghost returned to claim his soul. Eleanor, Clara gasped, her voice trembling. Oh, thank God. Eleanor, honey, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you're coming back to the firm. I stopped 5 feet from the table. I didn't look at my sister. I looked at Chairman Han. I bowed a perfect, deep 45-degree bow. Chairman Han, I said in flawless formal Korean, I apologize for the behavior of these strangers. They do not represent the values I was raised with. Chairman Han's face softened. He stepped around the table and bowed back a gesture of respect that made the room gasp. Elena Vance, he said. I am glad to see the architect has returned to her building. I am not returning to the Vance Group, Chairman, I said. my voice projecting to the very back of the room. I am here as the executive vice president of Apex Alpha, and we have a proposal for you that doesn't involve algorithms or spreadsheets. It involves a promise. I looked at Julian and Clara. They were broken. In that single moment, I saw the end of their careers, the end of my father's empire, and the end of the Vance name as a symbol of power. Julian tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was just a man in an expensive suit, realizing that he had tried to play a god with a toy he bought for $199. "Security," Mr. Park called out. 6 guards stepped forward. They didn't touch Julian or Clara, but they formed a wall of dark fabric and stern faces. "Please escort the debtors to the exit," Mr. Park said. As Julian and Clara were led out of the boardroom, their faces pale, their eyes glazed with shock, I felt a strange sense of peace. The rage was gone. The grief was gone. There was only the work. "Well, Chairman," I said, turning back to the table where Victor Sterling was now standing, having walked down from the gallery to join me. "Shall we talk about the future?" Chairman Hahn smiled a real, genuine smile. "Let us talk, Eleanor. But first, let us have tea. Properly." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds over Seoul. In San Francisco, my father's phone was likely ringing off the hook as the stock market opened to the news of his ruin. But here in this room, the air was clear. The architect was back. And this time, she wasn't just building a bridge, she was building a throne. The fallout was a tectonic shift that didn't just rattle the windows of the Vance Tower. It brought the entire glass ceiling crashing down. By the time the black sedans carrying Julian and Clara reached the guarded gates of the Schiller Hotel, the Vance Group's stock hadn't just dipped. It had nosedived into a dark, bottomless abyss. Being branded with a bad faith tag by a global titan like Han Guk was a contagion that turned every Vance asset into toxic waste overnight. In the hyper-connected world of global finance, a reputation takes 30 years to build and 30 seconds to incinerate. I sat in the mahogany-lined library of Chairman Han's private residence, the air thick with the scent of expensive incense, ancient parchment, and rain-dampened cedar. It was a room designed for quiet contemplation, but the silence was shattered by the frantic, rhythmic vibration of my burner phone. It danced across the low tea table like a dying insect, its screen lighting up with a name I had spent my whole life trying to please. It was my father. For the 22nd time in 3 hours, I let it ring until the final desperate vibration before picking up. I didn't say hello. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a greeting. I simply waited for the explosion of a dying empire. "Eleanor, what the hell have you done?" Arthur Vance's voice was thin, ragged, and stripped of the booming, godlike authority that had dictated my entire existence. "The board is in a total frenzy. The creditors are already calling in the equity on the Sausalito estate. Julian and Clara are being detained at Incheon for a financial audit. The Koreans won't let them board their flight. Tell me you can fix this. Tell me this is just some high-level negotiation tactic to get a bigger seat at the table." "It's not a tactic, Dad," I said, my voice as flat and cold as a frozen lake in midwinter. "It's a consequence. You taught me that business is a series of causes and effects. You were the cause. This is the effect. You can't outsource accountability to an algorithm." "I will give you anything," he pleaded, the sound of his pride shattering audible through the digital line. "I'll fire Julian on a public stage. I'll demote Clara to some back-office branch in the Midwest where she can't touch a single contract. I'll give you the $10 million commission. Hell, I'll make it 20. Just walk back into that boardroom. Tell Han you were mistaken. Tell him the AI had a processing glitch, and you've been reinstated with full veto power." "You still don't get it, do you?" I whispered, feeling a strange mix of pity and disgust. You think this is about a paycheck. You think you can just pay a fixer fee, and the world will reset to the way it was when you were king. I sat in that boardroom for 7 years, Dad. I warned you about Julian's hollow arrogance. I warned you that the AI didn't understand the soul of the deal. You chose a $199 subscription over your own blood. Now that subscription is the only thing left of your legacy. Why don't you ask the AI to fix your stock price? Elena, please. He whimpered. It was a pathetic, wet sound. Your mother. She's hysterical. They're talking about seizing the vintage car collection. The contractors walked off the job at her wellness studio because the corporate cards were declined. We'll be in the streets, Eleanor. Think of the scandal. The streets are fine, Dad. I spent the last few days in a motel in Oakland where the towels smell like cigarettes, and the lock is just a suggestion. It builds character, right? Isn't that what you told me when you sent me to boarding school at 6 years old? I'll send you the address of the motel, but bring cash. They don't take Vance credit cards anymore. I checked. You monster! He hissed, his grief curdling back into familiar impotent rage. You'd destroy your own father over a promotion. We raised you. We gave you the Vance name. You gave me a 10-minute escort to the curb, I reminded him, my voice sharpening into a blade. You gave Clara my childhood bedroom for a violin studio. You gave my 7 years of blood, sweat, and tears to a man who thinks culture is something you find in a grocery store. You didn't raise a daughter, Arthur. You raised an architect, and I just decided that your building was structurally unsound, so I pulled the support beams. I hung up. The silence that followed was heavy, sweet, and final. The transition from disgraced daughter to global strategist happened with a speed that left the industry breathless. While Julian and Clara were stuck in a cold legal limbo at Incheon, their passports flagged due to unsettled debts and bad faith penalties owed to the South Korean state, I was sitting in the high-tech war room at Apex Alpha's Seoul headquarters. Victor Sterling stood at the head of the table, his eyes gleaming with the predatory joy of a man who had waited 20 years for the king to fall. The Vance Group's domestic partners are jumping ship like rats from a burning galley, Victor announced, tapping a glass screen that showed the global biotech supply chain turning from Vance Blue to Apex Red. Without the Hanguk patents, their manufacturing plants in Ohio and Singapore are nothing but expensive warehouses. They have no product to move. Their contracts are defaulting by the hour. Sure. We don't just want the plants, Victor, I said, stepping up to the console and expanding the data map. The hardware is secondary. I want the talent. There are 300 senior researchers in the Vance labs who stayed because they believed in the science, not the name. I want to launch the Phoenix Initiative immediately. We offer them double their salaries, full intellectual autonomy, and we move them under the new Apex Hanguk Alliance. Shit, that's a massive upfront investment, Victor noted, though he was already nodding in agreement. At least 200 million in signing bonuses and relocation. It's a bargain, I countered. It saves us 5 years of R&D and ensures that when the Vance Group finally declares bankruptcy, there's nothing left for the creditors to liquidate but the office furniture. I want to leave my father with nothing but empty buildings and that $199 software he loves so much. Let's see how agile he is when he's the only one left in the tower. Victor chuckled, a dark, appreciative sound. You're not just taking his deal, Eleanor. You're performing a total system override. As we finalized the Apex Hanguk merger, a deal now valued at a staggering $4.5 billion due to the sheer market dominance of our combined patents, I began my final move against the crown jewel, the Vance Tower itself. I called Silas, my lawyer in San Francisco, on a secure line. Silas, give me the numbers. Don't sugarcoat it. It's a bloodbath, Elena. It's poetic, Silas purred. Arthur used the building's deed as collateral for the Hanguk insurance bond. He was so sure of the algorithmic certainty Julian sold him that he didn't even hedge the risk. When the deal died and the $500 million penalty was triggered, the bank moved into emergency liquidation. They don't have the cash flow to pay their electric bill, let alone the interest on the tower. Who holds the primary note? Bank of America. But they're terrified of the optics. They want to offload the debt to a private equity firm before the evening news turns the Vance name into a global meme for corporate failure. Buy it, I commanded. Use the Apex Alpha Acquisition Fund. I want the deed to 555 California Street on my desk before Julian's flight even touches down in San Francisco. You're going to be your own father's landlord? Silas asked. That's cold even for you. No, Silas, I said, looking out at the Seoul skyline as the sun began to rise. I'm going to be the person who changes the locks. I want him to feel exactly what it's like to stand on the sidewalk with a cardboard box while the world moves on without him. By the end of the week, the global business journals were calling it the Seoul slaughter. Post-mortems were already being written about how technological hubris destroyed a 40-year-old American empire. Julian Thorne's name became shorthand for AI-driven suicide. But I wasn't reading the news. I was preparing for the homecoming. I flew back to San Francisco on Sunday night on my own Gulfstream. The cabin was a silent, luxurious capsule of white leather and polished chrome. Victor Sterling sat across from me, reviewing the final merger documents. "You're a legend in Seoul," Victor said, looking over his glasses. "Chairman Han told the press you were the only bridge left standing in a world of burning wood. He credited the entire success of the merger to your unwavering integrity." "I just gave him the one thing my father couldn't," I said. "I gave him my word, and I kept it." I looked down at my hand. The Norige silk knot was still tied to my bag, a humble reminder of where I had started the week in a dinky motel in Oakland, selling my watch for a stack of hundreds, just to stay afloat. I was ending it as the owner of the skyline. The architect hadn't just returned to the building, she had redesigned the entire foundation of her life. As the wheels touched down at SFO, a final text came through from Clara. "Clara Eleanor, please. Mum is crying. They're taking the art collection. They're taking the piano. How can you be so heartless? We're family. We made you." I looked at the message for a long time, feeling nothing but a profound sense of closure. Then I typed back the only words that mattered, the words Julian had used to kick me into the gutter just 7 days ago. "Eleanor, it's not personal, Clara. It's just agile. Enjoy the software. I hear it's great for calculating debt." I shut off the phone and stepped out into the crisp, salty San Francisco air. The Vance Tower was waiting for me, and for the first time in history, the name on the door was going to mean exactly what it was supposed to. My name. My rules. My empire. Monday morning in San Francisco arrived with a clarity that felt surgical. The usual blanket of fog had retreated, leaving the city's skyline exposed in the harsh, uncompromising light of the Pacific sun. I stood at the intersection of California and Montgomery, looking up at 555 California Street. The gold-plated Vance Group lettering that had dominated the marble facade for decades was gone, leaving behind only ghostly outlines on the stone-faded shadows of a name that no longer held credit. I didn't enter through the side door. I walked straight through the massive brass revolving doors of the main lobby. The security detail was new. Silas had swapped the company's contract over the weekend. The guards didn't reach for their radios to call for an escort. Instead, they stood at a rigid, respectful attention. One of them, a man who had watched me be escorted out just 7 days ago, offered a sharp, nervous nod. "Good morning, Miss Vance," he whispered. "The board is waiting in the penthouse." "Thank you, Miller," I said, remembering his name. "And tell your team to relax. The era of security as intimidation is over." The express elevator ride to the 50th floor used to feel like an ascent to a throne. Today it felt like a walk through a gallery of my own making. When the doors slid open, the high-octane buzz of the office had been replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Employees, the ones Julian hadn't managed to alienate or fire yet, stood by their glass-walled cubicles, watching me with a mix of terror and desperate hope. I walked past Julian's agile hub, where the $199 AI terminals sat, dark and dormant. They looked like cheap toys left behind in a house that had been reclaimed by adults. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom. The scene inside was a portrait of a collapsed dynasty. My father was sitting in the high-back chair at the head of the table, staring out at the Golden Gate Bridge. He looked smaller, his expensive wool suit hanging off a frame that seemed to have shrunk 3 sizes in a week. Beside him stood Clara, her face blotchy from crying, clutching a designer handbag like a life preserver. Julian was nowhere to be seen. I knew from Silas that he was currently in a windowless room at a firm in Palo Alto, trying to explain to federal investigators why he had manipulated sentiment analysis data to mislead the Vance Group board. "You're early," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't turn around. "I'm exactly on time, Arthur," I said, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. The foreclosure was finalized at 8 a.m. As of 10 minutes ago, the deed to this building, the intellectual property of the Vance Labs, and the remaining domestic assets have been transferred to Sterling Vance Global. Clara finally broke. "Eleanor, you can't do this. Mom is at the house right now, packing her jewelry into grocery bags. They're taking the Steinway. It's been in the family for 3 generations. The piano was collateral for a bridge loan Julian took out to cover the Hanguk insurance premium." I said, my voice devoid of malice but stripped of warmth. "If you want to blame someone for the loss of family heirlooms, look at the man you supported in that boardroom last week. He gambled the history of this family on a subscription service." "We were just trying to grow," Clara shrieked. "We were trying to be disruptive. That's what you always wanted, isn't it? For us to be as smart as you." "No, Clara," I said, standing up. "I wanted you to be as honest as me. There's a difference between disruption and deception. You didn't want to grow. You wanted to win without doing the work. You wanted the crown without the weight of the kingdom." I walked over to the windows, standing a few feet away from my father. I could see the tiny dots of the ferries crossing the bay. "The Sausalito house is gone, Arthur," I said quietly. "But I've instructed Silas to set up a trust. It's a modest annuity. It will cover a comfortable apartment in the city for you and Mom. No penthouse, no staff, but you won't be in the streets. Clara, you have your own savings, assuming you didn't let Julian optimize them. I suggest you find a career that doesn't involve leadership." Arthur finally turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot. The fire of the titan of industry extinguished, leaving only cold ash. "Why the apartment? Why not just let us drown?" "You've made your point." "Because I'm a Vance," I said, and the irony wasn't lost on me. "And despite what you taught me, a Vance doesn't leave their people behind, even the ones who failed the mission. I'm doing this for Mom, and I'm doing it because I don't want your failure to be the last thing people remember about this name." I signaled to Silas, who was waiting in the hallway with a team of transition specialists. They filed in, carrying tablets and legal folders. The takeover was clinical, efficient, and absolute. "You have 30 minutes to clear your personal effects," Silas informed them. As Clara led my father toward the door, she stopped and looked at me one last time. There was no sisterly bond left, just the raw, jagged edge of a bridge burned beyond repair. They walked out, their footsteps echoing in the hallway until the elevator chimed and they were gone. I sat down in the chair at the head of the table. It was still warm. I didn't feel the rush of ego I expected. I felt the weight. My phone buzzed. It was a secure video link from Seoul. I tapped the screen and Chairman Han's face appeared. He was in his garden, the morning light in Korea soft and golden. "Elena, see," he said, bowing slightly. "I see the horizon behind you has changed." "The foundation is finally level, Chairman," I replied, bowing back. Good, because the world does not wait for buildings to dry, Han said, a hint of a smile on his face. The Apex Hanguk laboratories in Incheon have just successfully synthesized the first stable batch of the Tier 4 protein. We need the San Francisco logistics team to begin the FDA filing by midnight your time. I'll have the researchers in the lab within the hour, I said. And, Chairman, we're doing the filing by hand, no AI shortcuts. I want every line of data verified by a human eye. I would expect nothing less from the architect, he said. I ended the call and looked out at the office. The fear in the eyes of the employees was beginning to melt into curiosity. They were looking for a leader. I stood up and walked out of the boardroom into the center of the floor. I didn't need a microphone. Listen up, I called out. The office went silent. The Vance Group is dead. As of today, this is Sterling Vance Global. If you're here because you want a shortcut to a bonus, the elevators are behind me. But if you're here because you believe that science requires integrity and that a deal is a promise made between people, then sit down. We have a lot of work to do, and we're going to do it right. One by one they sat. The hum of the computers began again, but this time it sounded different. It sounded like a heartbeat. I walked to my new desk, not the one in the corner office, but one in the heart of the research floor. I reached into my bag and pulled out the Norigai silk knot. I didn't hide it in a drawer. I hung it on the corner of my monitor. The bright red threads, a stark contrast to the steel and glass. It was a reminder that you can build a tower out of anything. But if you want it to stand against the wind, you have to weave it with something that can't be bought for $199. I opened the first file of the Hanguk merger. The architect was home. And for the first time in her life, the building was finally hers.